Yeah, Mark, appreciate the question about low Earth orbit satellites and what this means for broadband, specifically what SpaceX, Starlink, and similar technologies mean for broadband, especially in rural areas. Let's define a couple of terms first. Low Earth orbit is the orbital range up to about 1,000 kilometers. Beyond 1,000 kilometers is medium Earth orbit. And then, of course, there's a special band of medium Earth orbit and high Earth orbit that's referred to as geosynchronous. And that just simply means the satellite appears to stay in roughly the same place throughout the day. Low Earth orbit, on the other hand, the satellites move around. You can actually see this if you ever track an International Space Station pass. You can see those, or if you ever see an iridium flare, where an iridium satellite is reflecting the sun, and it looks like just a really bright flash of light. And sometimes you can track them, most of the time you can't. Low Earth orbit satellites have some advantages, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Um, I have used geosynchronous satellite internet before. That has been one of the go-to solutions for rural areas that don't have DSL even. Some even don't have dial-up. They're so far back in the sticks. And I actually have a friend. She's a consultant for a major software company that does software for law enforcement. And she has a satellite connection. And it is one of the most horrible things she's ever used. Geosynchronous satellites are a long way away. They're 36,000 kilometers away. And so you have this thing called latency. Latency is how quickly you get an answer back after you send a question. Latency is a real serious issue. Video conferencing, for instance, there's latency involved. That's why people tend to, if they're doing a video conference, if they talk over top of each other, you get that lag and they stop and start. Cell phones do the same thing. Latency creates a jerkiness to the response, a delay, a pause. And with modern websites and video conferencing, especially requiring a lot of round trip communications, latency becomes a real killer. So while satellite internet from geosynchronous satellites has great bandwidth down, it has horrible latency, and it has very narrow bandwidth going back up. So trying to do a video conference over a satellite link, you can see the end uh, away from the consumer of that service, but the consumer of that service has great difficulty getting their video back up to the satellite and then down because of the narrow bandwidth. Low Earth orbit satellites address the latency side of it. They're lower in orbit, the round trip is shorter, and therefore the packet gets up and down much, much quicker. They still have an issue with asymmetric bandwidth, where the bandwidth up is typically less than down. Although I think I read where Starlink in particular is 100 meg both up and down, and that's quite amazing to me. So latency is the biggest advantage of low Earth orbit satellites over geosynchronous orbit. Of course, there are other advantages of satellite internet in general. Number one, there's no wire coming into your house. Lightning can't travel over a wire that doesn't exist. So you don't have a wire coming into your house as another conduit for lightning. That same wire has to go to a central office somewhere. That can be overhead wiring over things like telephone poles or power poles, or it can be underground through conduit. Both of those avenues of getting that last mile wire to the consumer are subject to weather and subject to other incidents, such as a backhoe cutting into the fiber, or a car hitting a power pole and causing the power pole to land on the ground and break the cable. So they're vulnerable to terrestrial sources of damage. A satellite connection, on the other hand, keeps going. You don't need the central office to have power. If you have a generator or a solar power system or your own hydro plant or whatever, and you have power and you have a satellite terminal, you don't rely on anybody else around you having power or having poles up. So there's some definite advantages, and you don't have to have cell sites. Cell sites are typically the single point of failure for a cellular-based bandwidth solution. Is the cell sites go down, they ice over, they lose power, they lose fiber connectivity, just like any other terrestrial connection. So satellite has its advantages, but low Earth orbit satellites means you have to have a lot of them. And in the case of Starlink in particular, they're putting up 30,000 or so satellites. And those satellites have a couple of disadvantages. First off, as the satellites pass overhead, your signal is constantly switching between satellites. A low Earth orbit pass will last about 10 minutes. So you're on one satellite for about 10 minutes, and then you're on another satellite. This is essentially the same technology as you use for cell phones, except in this case, you're stationary and the cells are moving overhead via satellite. But one of the things that Perry does is astronomy. We are also a certified international dark sky park. One of the major issues that low Earth orbit satellites have is they move and they reflect sunlight. And so if you get 30,000 satellites in orbit and they all reflect light, then astronomers around the world are already complaining about them, and there's just a few hundred in orbit. That's one of the downsides to lower Earth orbit satellites. One of the other downsides is rain. The frequencies that are being used have serious rain fade. So yeah, you are still somewhat subject to the weather patterns to get your internet. Rain, snow significantly interfere with satellite internet signals, both geosynchronous as well as low Earth orbit. But the other thing, and not being a conspiracy theorist or anything, I'm an RF engineer. I've done RF for a long time. I know the dangers of high energy RF exposure firsthand at different wavelengths. These dishes that are required for both geosynchronous and low Earth orbit satellites, they are radio transmitters. They are generating RF interference. They are generating RF energy. And at the frequencies they are, there may be unknown or unstudied interaction with the human body. There really needs to be, in my opinion at least, more study into this before going too heavy into the technology. But in terms of video streaming, in terms of education, in terms of even voice over IP telephone connections and whatnot, low Earth orbit has significant advantages based on its much lower latency than geosynchronous orbit. However, this does not do away with the need for terrestrial connectivity. Terrestrial connectivity can have much lower latency yet. While it takes, it can have much lower latency. Fiber connections, copper connections even, and some of these new experimental air core fibers that have the lowest latency of all that are being used by super high frequency stock traders. They have much lower latency, and they have much higher reliability in the long term. So if you're operating a data center, you don't want to do it over a satellite, just as a for instance. But for a student at home, it's ideal technology.